Tengo el gran honor en este momento de invitar al excelentísimo señor Celso Amorim, Ministro de Relaciones Exteriores del Brasil, a que tome la palabra.
Mr. President, distinguished heads of state and government, honorable ministers, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, first of all, let me, from the bottom of my heart, congratulate you on this great accomplishment, which is to enable the United Nations to deal seriously and with great content on this question of the financial crisis. The losses entailed by the current economic crisis affect economies and societies all across the globe. Brazil has been an enthusiastic supporter of a stronger role for the United Nations in the debate about the financial and economic crisis. President Lula has been personally committed to this goal. In his statement at the General Assembly, he advanced proposals for a UN response to the crisis. Since then, President Lula has consistently raised the issue in a number of meetings, such as the G20, the BRICS, and other summits, and in contacts with other leaders. At the UN, countries without a voice in the existing financial governance structures are able to put forth their views. Some of them are among the poorest of the world and were hit the hardest by the global economic downturn. They bear no responsibility for the current crisis, and we must listen to their concerns. We must keep their interests in mind in our collective action towards recovery. Last December, in Doha, the daunting possibility of a financial collapse in the developed world faced us all. The depth and scope of the turmoil remained largely unknown. Our decision to create a mandate for this conference proved to be timely. We established a multilateral process to discuss the financial crisis based on the inclusiveness and legitimacy of the United Nations. 6 months later, despite some positive signs, the global picture is still gloomy, particularly for the poorest countries. Many of their hard-earned gains in economic growth, poverty reduction, and social development over recent years were lost or severely reduced. The possibility of achieving the Millennium Development Goals by 2015 has become seriously jeopardized. Contraction of demand and scarcity of trade finance for poor countries dim the prospects of recovery. Market access opportunities may pave the way for developing countries to eradicate poverty and hunger. We cannot overstate the importance of a successful conclusion of the Doha Development Agenda. It would send a strong message against protectionism, including the potentially negative effects of the stimulus packages put together by rich countries. Most developing countries depend on agricultural exports. The elimination of distorting subsidies by rich countries would have an important impact on poor countries' ability to trade their way out of recession. It would also give an effective contribution to the food security of these nations. Additional efforts by developed countries to fulfill their obligations in relation to ODA are urgently called for. Cash transfers of 0.7% of rich countries' GDPs amount to a relatively small figure for those who would be in a position to hand them out. Indeed, this is less than the amount paid by the OECD countries to their inefficient farmers. But they may make the difference between life and death for some of the potential beneficiaries. ODA alone will not suffice. Additional measures by multilateral and regional financial institutions to provide liquidity and trade financing for South-South trade is also necessary. The resources of the IMF and the World Bank ought to be increased. Regional development banks must be reinforced so that they can help rebuild ailing economies. Least developed countries should, of course, receive priority attention. Brazil announced for the first time a contribution to the IMF and has expressed support for the recapitalization of multilateral development banks. We are in favor of a new allocation of special drawing rights. Distribution of these resources must take into account the needs of developing countries, especially the poorest ones. The regime of restrictive conditionalities imposed on developing countries by multilateral financial institutions must be thoroughly overhauled. Counter-cyclical policies targeting social protection, cash transfer programs, health and education, industry bailouts, infrastructure, and employment should not be the privilege of the rich. In fact, developing countries need them most. These include countries not in a position to finance such measures with their own means. Lending institutions must update their paradigm in favor of stimulus measures in developing countries. It is imperative that these countries' policy space and ownership of programs be fully respected. The belief in the self-regulation of markets was one of the main causes of the crisis. We welcome the effort made so far to expand and reinforce the regulation of economic and financial activities, but these actions have been limited to the national realm. They must be coordinated globally. Developing countries and emerging economies should continue to look for creative means to protect themselves from the fluctuation of major currencies. Our experiment with Argentina of trading on local currency is a case in point. Mr. President, the path of full recovery may be long and winding. We need to look beyond the short term and define a new framework for development and financing that should outlast the crisis and prevent new ones. The role of the state, alongside private enterprise, as a regulator and as a promoter of development, must be reappraised. If anything, this crisis has relegated the theory of the minimal state to the museum of the ideological misconceptions. Let me take the example of Brazil. As everyone else, Brazil was affected by the crisis, but it was spared from some of its worst effects. To a great extent, this was due to the fact that we diversified our trading partners, invested in the internal market by redistributing income, and promoted the expansion of infrastructure. On all these three dimensions, the role of the state was crucial. Our challenges call for reforms in the global governance. The 60-year-old decision-making structures of certain bodies in the UN itself and of the Bretton Woods institutions are outdated. They no longer reflect current economic and political realities. The current structures fall short both in terms of legitimacy and effectiveness. Quotas and voting rights in multilateral financial institutions must be updated. We are confident that a comprehensive reform can be reached by April 2010 or January 2011. The Bretton Woods institutions must be more open to cooperation with the UN General Assembly and the ECOSOC. This is essential to ensure greater transparency and accountability to the global economic policy debate. Mr. President, my dear friend, Padre Descotto, this conference is an historic opportunity for change. It has brought the UN membership closer together to strengthen, improve, and reform global economic governance. The fact that we have been able to agree under your leadership on balanced and an ambitious outcome document is a testament to the vitality of the UN. It has disproved many of the skeptics. We owe much of the success in this enterprise to your able leadership as well as the facilitators. This conference should not be a final point, nor should it be an end in itself. It is incumbent upon us, UN members, to ensure that it is the beginning of a process by means of which the whole of mankind, and not just a few, take ownership of their own destiny. I thank you.